And good morning, everyone. And when Sriram says I'm very committed, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, that's $34 billion worth of acquisition of open source. So that's one measure of commitment. So I am really glad to be here and really happy to see so many, a packed room, and really for a full day of education and certification. And it is something, I know Sriram, you said it many times, I want to thank you for collaborating with us, but also to tell you how much we really want to be part of this and drive this dynamic community. And there's no more exciting place for IBM to do this than in India. With 4 million developers and counting, you're the #2 country in the world of developers, 5 million, I think, in the US, so you're quickly going to surpass. Is that correct? So, and Sriram, you said all of the things being built. I mean, often there's a phrase people use, which is the world is rewritten in code, which that means it's happening here, that you actually get to rewrite how the world operates in code. And there is no better way, I think, for us to commit how to help you innovate than to reaffirm our commitment to open source. Give me a feel. How many of you are strong open source supporters in the room? Okay. Well, okay, that would be everyone. Okay, excellent. So then you are all my friends right now. So I thought actually in my couple minutes before I have what I think is a really great panel, just to make a couple comments about open source. One is I want to step back and just reiterate the value of open source. Frankly, it's in almost everything we interact with. So whether it's a web browser, whether it's your smartphone, whether it's anything in your house, whether it's every almost operating system has a piece of open source in it. So you could call that ubiquitous. Sriram just talked a lot about data and analytics. It's in almost every data and analytics. How many of you work on data and analytics? Okay, a third. And how many of you therefore work on open source and data and analytics? Okay, almost the same number of people. It's synonymous. And when I look at the work, the most interesting work we're doing around the world, things like with Maersk, they are the world's largest global shipper. This is all based on open source, the work that we're doing. Or I look at all the hybrid cloud work, open source, like the work we're doing here with Vodafone Idea. So it is pervasive. And to kick off the panel, I want to share 3 principles that we believe, and I believe really strongly in, and I hope you agree with them. And to me, these are the reasons open source can be so good and can thrive. So the first one, if you're a strong supporter of open source, the first thing is that if you take open source out and use it, you have to give something back. First principle. If you take, you have to return. The second principle we believe strongly in is open governance. So we support open governance. We think it is the best thing. I'll talk a little more about it. And the third is a principle that says we're here to enable a really big ecosystem, enable the widest ecosystem you can. So just a couple comments on each one. First one, how many of you take out, raise your hand if you already did tell me everybody uses open source. How many of you give back? Okay, so there's others that have work to do here. So that's the point. And I want to, when I say it's a principle for IBMs that if you take out, you give back, I look around the room. Some of you probably weren't even working at the time when we started our work with open source. It was with the Linux Foundation 20 years ago. Does anyone remember that? The front row, okay, which dates the front row. Anybody else remember that? It was 20 years ago, IBM made a $1 billion donation to the Linux Foundation. And it was at that time to really industrialize and bring into the enterprise Linux as an operating system. And then since then, though, we've continued. So whether it was Apache or Eclipse, other foundations, and it's always been about how to get open source into the enterprise. And if I go back 20 years, Red Hat was a fledgling sort of beginning startup open source company. And what they worked on was to say, well, if an enterprise was going to use open source, good, but enterprises had different requirements. Security, versioning, how I supported it. It had to have a kind of the last mile is what I think about it for the enterprise. And that's what they started on. Well, fast forward to today, and that's what we worked on. In October, IBM announced the acquisition of Red Hat, which is the world's leading open source company, to really drive, because we believe the future is around open source based technology. And hopefully with our help, we'll be able to scale even wider around the world and across all platforms. Because what it really does for clients is allow them portability in many cases. So develop once, run anywhere you would like. And that's really important in the world of hybrid cloud, where you're going to talk about private clouds, public clouds, therefore hybrid altogether. So our history started 20 years ago, contributing. Thousands of IBMers still to this day contribute to open source. And many projects we brought to life. And I know one of them we'll talk about while we're up on the stage is Hyperledger. So how many of you work blockchain? Okay, I'm happy to see so. Well, you've got a lot of disciples here. We're going to talk about this with Julian in a second. Lots of disciples of Hyperledger, which is from the Linux Foundation, open source for blockchain. We were the original founders of contribution to this and really helped get going with the Hyperledger project. Actually, you'll have to correct me, Julian, one of the fastest growing projects in the Linux Foundation? The fastest, oh, excuse me, the fastest, okay? So, but this idea, this was our contribution. Blockchain's gonna be, gosh, it's gonna be in tens of billions as a market, particularly around supply chain. We've done over 500 projects, and the real value is a network. So over 75 networks. And those of you that know anything about blockchain, or just even the internet, you've gotta have an open standard foundation, and that's what this is for it. So, a little bit of a long answer to, if you're gonna use open source, you got to contribute. Our contribution's been not only in 1 billion to get Linux going, but as we've continued, thousands and thousands of people, and now the acquisition of Red Hat. Second principle, however, and this is to me perhaps the most important one, all of us to support open governance. Because with open governance, this is really all about getting better, stronger products at the end of the day. And when I say open governance, there are many people who start an open source project, could be an individual project, which is okay. But to really get it to sort of take flight, it does need to have a lot of diverse sponsorship. And that's often what we try to do, is to convene lots of foundations, organizations, competitors, other companies, to all come together to support the governance. And it's really for one major reason. You're all developers. If a project has open governance, we think the chances are higher it'll run across many, many platforms and not be almost proprietary otherwise. So the idea is to run across lots of platforms, and therefore this gives you or your companies the best portability that's going to be out there. And then I'll end with our third principle, I said, and then I think it's our job to really enable, engage the widest ecosystem. And honestly, that means working with all of our competitors. So it was about 2 years ago that IBM actually launched Istio. Now, that's with Google, that's with others, that's with Lyft, a lot of other open source companies. And this is about a secure container fabric, which if we don't have a secure container fabric, containers, Kubernetes, which we think is the fabric of the future, that's what you gotta have. And so no better way than to have launched this. So you want a really wide ecosystem. It's hundreds, maybe even thousands, startup companies and broader that are all part of this. Lots of examples like that. So I just wanted to kick off this panel with those 3 principles that we really believe in. And you take, you return, open governance, and enable the widest ecosystem. And I would just encourage you to join us in building this open source community and the open source world. But you're going to enjoy, I believe, now a very interesting panel. So I get the pleasure to kick this whole day off by hosting the panel and having a conversation. So I thought about, we've got a member from, think of it as 3 parts of the whole ecosystem that's out here. So on one hand, right from the Linux Foundation, Julian Gordon, who is the Vice President of Linux Foundation out of Asia Pacific. I'll introduce each, you can come up as a team. I'll just quick do it, is gonna join us. So now you've got the foundation around open source. From Royal Bank of Scotland, I've got Dr. Lata Iyer, and she is head of, think of all of their AL, or machine learning, analytics, the whole center of competency around data, digital experience, and the like. And she'll come and speak as a consumer of this, the enterprise side of this. And then Gautam Khanna, he is head of all of the modernization work at Infosys. So he's going to represent all the global systems integrators, including IBM. You're going to represent the community here. And so all three are going to come up, and I'm going to have them each share some of their wisdom with you. So can I ask the three of you to join me? So. Okay. Welcome, you guys. Strong supporters. They know some of the questions, some I'm going to make up. Okay, so let's. I thought we're going to start with some easy ones for our group here, if that's okay. So the first one is to Julian.
Okay.
And I just want him to share with you how big, how broad, really, the Linux Foundation is and the reach of open source. Just kind of generally give the group your sense of how big of a movement this is, if I say it that way.
Okay, definitely, and I think it's actually beyond just the Linux Foundation. We have Eclipse
That's
Foundation.
why I say a movement,
yes,
right?
And Apache, and there are hundreds of other independent projects, right? So we're just part of that, and we're very happy to be part of that. So I think that open source is just growing at an amazing, the world of open source is growing at an amazing speed. We see it up every part of the stack, up and down, is now running on open source, and pretty well every part of modern compute is running on open source. So if I was to take kind of three kind of areas in terms of open source within Linux Foundation, of course we have Linux. We talked about Linux and great contribution that IBM made.
The foundation.
It's a foundation, and it runs the majority of the compute in the world. And even today, we have 10,000 lines of code every day contributed to Linux Foundation. It is live. It is a growing project. Now, but that innovation has now really spread to many different sectors within the software. Every corner, I would say, of software in the world is now being touched by open source. So just to take the examples of the big things, AI. So we have an AI project. We have blockchain, Hyperledger, of course.
Julian works a lot on Hyperledger.
Yes, slightly biased there, right?
Yeah.
And then we have a cloud, which have Cloud Foundry, and we have obviously the famous Kubernetes. And then even beyond that, if you just take industry sectors, we have in energy, we have a program around LF Energy, which is looking at how exchanges are working, grids are working. And then I think probably the most interesting, very recently.
I was going to ask you, what's the most interesting one?
Well, the most interesting one, or maybe most glamorous one, should put it that way, is we have the movie industry. So we have a project called the Academy Software Foundation, set up by the Academy, who gives out the Oscars. They've set up, Jim Zemlin pulled together and worked with all the different studios, and now they're working together on an open source program to create open source software for the movie industry and the gaming industry, which I think is amazing.
Anybody in here working in the movie industry? Bollywood? Do I have anyone?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody
you can say anything you want then.
Or anybody who wants to, right?
Yeah, okay. Anyone who wants to is a different question. Okay, yeah.
And then the other proof point is that we have about 30,000 open source developers out there actively working on.
How many?
30,000. That's the number that we see, who are working in open source today in those projects, creating, using innovation to create scale and speed, developing those large projects.
If you had to look back, say 5 years to today, and just had to pick a factor of the growth of this community, not just in number, just kind of that gut feeling, has it been a 10x fold, a 5x? What would you, just to give it a momentum feeling?
I don't know, but if you take Kubernetes, it's going from
0 to?
Well, it's thousands. And if you look just at something like in San Francisco, in Amsterdam, they're doing a Kubernetes event and a CNCF event. They've got 12,000 developers turning up, and that is just unheard of. Yeah. So the great interest is just growing. And we're seeing, and I think it's that switch of mentality about people look at, not asking, asking, should we do open sources? Why shouldn't we do open source? That kind of flip. And I think that is the change.
So Latte, you're a good companion to this then, because the reason it's growing is that enterprise, I mean everyone, not just individuals, gamers, everyone, including regulated industries using it. And so you represent a big piece at RBS of the innovation side of this. So why don't you just talk about your view of innovation and the role open source plays in it?
Yeah, especially in our years, the contemporary fields like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and digital analytics is some of the very contemporary fields where we have been exploring how this could enable the digital way to support the customers. I would strongly encourage that open source has been very helpful to, especially the sources of knowledge is so immense in the AI field, right? And people can get lost off track, which tools to use. And we have been encouraging our developers to adopt some of the open source platforms so that they know exactly this is coming from the very contemporary researchers and technologists, and any new development that happens in this field is something that the developers can take advantage of it. So we encourage that any innovation and the first of a kind projects to be done through this. The other thing that as a bank, we see that there are a lot of good problems that we solve as a POC, right? But beyond the POC, when you want to productionize it, you need a proper global standards, right? And proprietary softwares do have a good advantage of it, but then how many softwares, what tools to use, it can be very encompassing. So we've been encouraging that, the deep platform, especially the distributed algorithm, evolutionary algorithm frameworks are very supportive to understand the whole transparent setup, how the whole AI models are getting developed. That's something we're very encouraging. The other thing that recently that has come up is spinning up, the ML platform, and as well as Leap that supports the cloud-based quantum computing, which is so essential for all the hyper-frequency kind of AI models. These are some of the encouragements we have been asking how people can not only leverage it, but also contribute back. So all our problems can be tested faster because it comes from a very larger community setup.
So would you talk a little more on, you mentioned about, and you do a lot of work on analytics, or a lot of work around AI. What I hear from many clients is, and I do believe they're in a period where there's been so much experimentation. I call it random acts of digital. They have random acts everywhere. Nothing is scaling yet. And so this is kind of chapter 2 to start scaling. How do you stop that from happening? Meaning you said, I got all these POCs. What is it that you do that helps your team move from POC to scale, yet still use open source?
So yeah, some of the areas we do use open source, especially the Kubernetes is something that we are looking into forward. Like if any of these AI problems could be driven like in microservices and ensure it. We have a very strong agile DevOps culture in the organization, and we are ensuring that the productionization story is very different from the POC, because on a POC you do on a limited data, but when you do on a production environment, these are like some real-time data that you're talking about, and obviously your current setup cannot help, and proprietary softwares take a longer time to solve those problems, but these open source community platforms can help on the productionized environment, because you have the way, the whole transparency in the framework that gets developed in these codes and source of codes that's coming from here, that helps in the richer of the solutions. And the big challenge in the AI, not only from a banking perspective, but even as a field, it's evolving. Productionization is a challenge, so that's why I think like open source cultures and the transparent algorithms and architectures, model flow, all can be very well mapped through this.
Okay, well Gautam, before I get to you, let me just go back to Julian one more point, because Latha just mentioned a couple times Kubernetes. And so why don't you, we talked a little bit about AI and all the machine learning, but talk about Kubernetes and, kind of it's really I'm pointing to how you see open source playing a role in the cloud. So that's probably one of the greatest instantiations.
So I always think of two words when I think of open cloud, open source and cloud, and that's really explosive growth. And we have two projects that, we have Kubernetes part of CNCF, and we have Cloud Foundry. Cloud Foundry is already in 80% of the top 500 Fortune 500 companies building applications. But I think the story is Kubernetes, and that growth, it has, in the last 3 years, become pretty well the standard for orchestrating and managing containers on the cloud. And it is just growing at a remarkable rate. We have thousands of developers involved in it, and we have an end user program, and it's just a very large ecosystem. You talked about ecosystems. So in Hyperledger, and it was very key for us to get many different constituents. And it has an end user program, about 100 different companies, I believe, in the end user program, 350 companies from startups to very large companies like IBM involved with membership, and then thousands of other companies involved in that ecosystem. And it's just...
it's clear it's going to be the standard, right?
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Very clear about that.
Is, exactly.
All right, so Gautam, let me pull you into this. Why is it important? Many people here obviously do work for either a global systems integrator or a company or themselves. Why do you feel it's so important? You run a big practice to modernize applications for clients. Why have you set a priority around open source?
So it starts with clients. So all of our clients, and it's pervasive across automotive, banking, utilities, our clients are increasingly looking at open source first kind of an approach. And it is also a war for talent.
Why do they do it, Gautam? Why do you hear them say they do it first? Why do they look first?
So they feel that the innovation, a lot of the innovation that is happening, a lot of the problems that are getting solved by web scale problems are actually being solved in the open source arena. And that's the reason that they are looking at that. And it's also it's a war for talent. When we are interviewing, when we are taking in people, we get asked for GSIs as well as clients, is there a path to contribute? Can I contribute when I'm in your organization? So the interest is there for innovation, but it's also a war for talent. And if you look at GSIs, we have a very vast talent base. So how do we contribute back? So as Infosys, we are contributing to Kubernetes, PostgreSQL, Elastic, some of these as examples. And it is a question on how we work in the ecosystem, like you mentioned, for our clients, with our partners. To take an example, IBM has IBM Cloud Private. So we need to work with partners to see how we can bring some of these back to our clients. And frankly, it starts from the leadership. So our chairman, Nandan, is a big proponent of open source. And he's been a source of encouragement to adopt open source within Infosys as well as take it to our clients.
You know, you mentioned the talent war, and I think this point about a talent war, we all hire lots of smart people. We all hire lots of smart people, but you can't have them all. And this point that what open source allows you to do is to have lots of smart people working on your problems, because you'll never hire them all. None of us, as hard as we try, will get them all. And so that issue, that to say, you know, sort of knowing that you can't have them all, therefore you want to engage a wider community, is probably the #1 reason, really, to engage. And you really said that on some of these tough problems. People sometimes have an image that these are not the best programmers in the world. Actually, it is the best programmers in the world that are contributing into open source that's out there. So that's a very good thing. Now, Lada, because of that, you know, this is why I like the ecosystem up here. She represents a regulated industry. Usually people think regulated industry, open source, oop, can't do. So how do you think about balancing risk of when you use open source, or the kind, in being in a regulated industry?
Yeah, very appropriate. In fact, one of the big adoption methodologies that we have ensured that you have a curated software that's approved by the regulators. That's one way. That could be a proprietary and even open source software. That's something, a proper mechanism that we follow. The other is because risk and compliance is a very important element of it for any kind of a banking application to be launched. When you are doing it at a consumer side, we have a proper risk governance forum itself within the organization. We have actually adopted a proper standards, and we publish white papers at the EXCO level, get them approved. That actually defines a strategy. How do you go and adopt these solutions? Defining the standards across, say in the case of AI and blockchain, we define the model principles, we define the data principles, the ethics around it, the biasness around, and that could be like how an open source, does it take some bias of our data, or does it do a very inclusive prediction or exclusive prediction? So obviously all external standards, internal standards have to be met. And the most important thing is like we go through a proper GDPR governance guidelines. And that's why the partners like Infosys, IBM and all can help in defining, shaping up the governance and standards. And more and more, it's not about just open source, but it's also about the open standards, open governance that you already talked about. That's something we encourage. I'm part of myself as a CEO practice across the whole AI solutions that we do in the bank. They have to be catering to all this explainability of the models. The explainability of the models need a transparent setup, and that's where we see a scope of open source. But maybe we are not there in terms of defining standards, but that's where we are actually collectively defining it, and we discuss with the legal team, the security, inclusion, technology, and as well as the complete model risk governance. And any project that gets developed from POC to production, it goes through an entire process governance, and that's how then they are actually allowed to get launched.
Yeah, I mean, really a very serious sort of recommendation about a set of principles you live by and a process you go through and how you select what open source that you use. Now, I want to ask, you know, Gautam, I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to ask everybody. So how do you incent your workforce, and it doesn't have to be money, how do you incent your teams to want to contribute back? I said one of the principles is contribute back. So I'd like each of you to give your best idea on how do you incent your teammates to contribute back into open source?
So I think it's about access, recognition, and mentoring, especially for global SIs like us. So we need to create the right forums and avenues for developers to contribute, like we are working with the Linux Foundation to have a Kubernetes day at our Bangalore campus. And the second is recognition, public recognition to senior leadership. So ensuring that the really good developers get that. And see, it's about self-motivation, recognition, all of that is fine, but a lot of times people don't know where to start. So that's where mentoring comes in, and we are working with partners to help mentor smaller teams to be able to contribute, get them started, and then it's self-fueling, it's self-motivated.
Okay, good set of advice. In the mentoring in particular. Lata, what would you say?
Yeah, for us it's more about like participating in the hackathons, and obviously open source gives that avenue, and we ensure that more and more people participate in hackathons, and that gives an advantage for them to be exposed to more of the research and open source community, leveraging our developers onto it. The other thing is like asking them to publish the white papers on the Facebook of the RBS itself, because that gets a completely consolidation and accreditation from the wider community of the bank itself, so that we can do a transfer learning much better through some accomplished developers, through our white papers, and even we are also now encouraging people to publish research papers in some of the computer science journals around these areas, where they would have seen some breakthroughs using some of the areas, especially in the blockchain that we are planning to do. One of the key areas, especially again I'm emphasizing on AI because that's a big offering that I'm leading into it in the bank. The explainability of any of the models in banking is very crucial for the consumer of our bank itself, right? Explainability of AI is, if it is not addressed very well, none of the problems can be addressed using AI. So we are actually trying to understand how we can explain the models itself, and there we find that a lot of blockchain, the fabric kind of things are going to really helpful. And we are seeing, I was just talking to Julian about it, like how do we partner yourself and see that how we can accommodate fabric into our innovation programs for blockchain to explain the AI, because so that the GDPR guidelines are much taken care of.
Well, let's, if you guys will allow me, I'm going to divert on a little side conversation between AI and blockchain. So we'll come back to the incentive question, because Lata said something really important. I know many people in here raised their hand for data and analytics. We have our own set of principles around data and analytics, and one of them is, there's this third one that says, all these new technologies need to be explainable. And particularly when you're in a regulated industry, these models, if they cannot be explained, you will not be able to use them. Yes. And so explainability in everything we do is going to be critical. Now, so you teed up the importance of it, and that was part of incentivizing, getting people to publish, et cetera. But you also said, then there's another open source technology, perhaps blockchain, I can use to do the explainability of these models. Mr. Blockchain, do you want to speak up?
Okay, yeah, obviously blockchain is everywhere and pervasive and should be used by everybody.
I gave you a perfect entry. Okay.
That was our breakfast conversation.
That was our breakfast conversation, and definitely AI, there is a component of immutability of models and understanding those models aren't changed, especially autonomous vehicles. There's so many different models, so I think blockchain definitely.
Well, give the audience a commercial on blockchain.
A commercial on blockchain. So I think if I'll give a commercial on Hyperledger.
Hyperledger, excuse me, I meant Hyperledger.
Hyperledger Fabric, right? So if we look back 3 years, Hyperledger was contributed by IBM, by Fabric, and a very early fledgling time of business blockchain, and roll forward 3 years. This project is one of the leading blockchain platforms on the planet. And we see, and it's a version 1.4 going to version 2, and we have hundreds of production systems in place today, chains in today, right? Which was one unexpected by. This is beating, I would say, expectations. And just give a few examples, just 3 examples that I see just recently. I was in Beijing, which I traveled to quite often, last week, and I had a bank there who has a chain, and where they're doing billions of transactions, trade finance transactions on their chain today. And that's saving them money, creating new business, so that is significant. I say another one, so let's go to the UK. We have, I think, a very famous one with IBM is Everledger, the tracking of diamonds. So one of the problems with diamonds is fraudulent diamonds getting into the chain, or what they call blood diamonds or conflict diamonds. And this ledger, which has been going now for over a year, has been able to significantly reduce the amount of fraud and actually identified a lot of fraud. So you know the diamond you wear is not one that has been in a conflict zone. And I would say thirdly is something not in production, but and one of the wonderful things about being a Hyperledger Fabric is that every morning I wake up, because it's open source, anyone can use it, anyone can download it, is that I find interesting things that people have done that I never thought they would do. So NASA, just I think 3 weeks ago, announced that it's using Hyperledger Fabric to see how it can reinvent air traffic control systems. And I could go on and on and on. There are so many different sectors, so many different industries doing so many interesting things with Hyperledger Fabric.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks for your good work in that. I mean, I'm very proud of IBM's contributions to it, because this will be a global standard, is already, and you guys have done a very nice job with it. And I was, you know, there is not a supply chain issue out there that can't be helped by blockchain. So it really, anything that has to connect to something else, and that you want to have a trusted transaction between 2 parties who may not know each other, that's the way to do it. So
it is adding provenance on food. You've got the Walmart example, right?
Yeah.
And also anything that's on a supply chain. Once it's on a supply chain and you can see the ERP system, you can do supply chain finance, and then you can securitize things on the supply chain. You're helping SMEs in the supply chain. It's just endless.
Do we have a session for developers on Hyperledger?
Yeah.
If not, yes? Okay, thank goodness. Otherwise, this was a wasted commercial for you. Okay, so let me segue back into kind of our lightning round now. And I want you to finish on incentivizing. And everybody here gave some good examples. What would be your best practice on how to incent everybody to contribute back?
Well, you know, in the end, it's new technology. You have to get involved in it. We talk traditionally setting up an open source program office. Somebody in your office could be in your company, just half of your headcount, who can look at the projects, understand what you're doing in your company, incentivize particularly to your company what works there. So I know that IBM has an example where they used to incentivize people in the amount of code they used to produce, but they turned that around and said, actually, the functions that are coded by the community. So changing that's more important. We do lots of things. I think one of the challenges actually is that people are concerned about. They don't know. It's a kind of, we don't know anything about open source. How do we get involved? Making it easier for people to contribute. And contribute is not also just about code. It's about fixing the documentation, et cetera, et cetera. There's many things.
Okay, so this is a very key point as well.
Yeah.
So 2 more lightning round questions, and we're going to go fast up and down the line. First one is, I want you to, again, we got lots of developers in the audience, all different parts of their career. Go back to your younger self. If you were no offense that you're not young already, I don't mean it that way, but your younger self, what advice would you give to yourself if you were just starting to use open source? Is there any 1 or 2 things you would have said, I would tell, or a brand new programmer I have, what would I tell them? So let's start with you, Gautam.
I think it's about immersing yourself in learning first. That would be my main thing, because the people who are now contributing within the company, they are absolutely the best learners. They learn extremely quickly. So it's your ability to learn, and obviously unless you apply, you won't be able to get there. So it's the learning part.
Lana?
Yeah, cross-skilling, upskilling possibilities are very high through open source. That's something I would see as best avenue to going and adopting open source and upskilling is a very huge, comes from a very large research community. That's exactly what I would see when I'm younger, in using the open source. The other is obviously reach out to my problems of securities and bugs that's there. All those open sources would do it. Maybe if we can solve it faster and spread it to a larger community, that's how I will look into it as a philosophy of applying open source. Like, how do we address it?
I should just get involved, and whatever you do, whatever you are, if you're going to evangelize the technology, you're not a coder, get involved. You're in code,
just get
involved, and as you say, fix a bug, low-hanging fruit, or even lower-hanging fruit. Fix some documentation, or if you're another, translate some documentation. Just get involved. Go to a meetup. It's a great community. Just come and join.
All right, now let's end on one last. I think it's a great question. Of course, I made it up. Let's give me what you think is. What would you say is the biggest myth about open source? Myth, and your greatest hope for open source. So, Gautam, can I start with you?
So the myth that we have to bust with our clients the most is open source is free. So at times they don't take into account all the costs involved, the cost of talent, scarcity, making suboptimal decisions on technology choices. So that's the biggest myth, so to speak. And the hope is on open source led to democratization of software. The hope for me is that there will be democratization of data for bringing transparency in AI, and a good example is the moments in time database that IBM put out in the public. I think that's a good start.
Good. All right, Latha?
Yeah, the myth, I say it's like it's free, as anyway I said. The other is obviously no accountability. Bugs, full of bugs, and no support given. Those are the myths that people see it, but that's not true. But the hope is like, how do we actually solve some of the security problems in the upstream and downstream of applications that you will drive through the open source. Those are something that I have very strong hope, and also about productionizing all your solutions through the open source in an enterprise solution. I see a lot of contribution coming into thing, and that's a hope that I see. In this area.
And actually, in open source, it's more secure because you have more eyes on the code, right?
Yeah.
That's true. So, Julian, you're going to wrap us up here.
Okay. So the myth is that for the large project, all the open source development is actually done in North America and Western Europe. I can tell you, period, that is not true. I work with developers who contribute here in India. I work with contributors in China and all around Asia Pacific. It is definitely a global phenomenon, and anyone can get involved. And we're trying to help developers here because there's sometimes a time zone thing. So we are setting up a boot camp. We had a boot camp up recently in Hong Kong where some Indian developers came, and people contributed on those 2 days. People had never contributed before. And we're going to bring this to Bangalore, probably in June. And yeah, we would love you to get involved, and we're going to help you take that first step in contribution if you haven't done it already.
Yeah, very interesting. And so the myth is that it's all North America. Your greatest hope for open source and a big stage.
My greatest hope is that these are, as you said, some of the smartest developers on the planet, that people here get more involved in contribution and do more contribution and maintenance. And I said, we want that to happen.
It is a great way to end this panel because India does have some of the greatest, smartest developers on the planet. And if they do contribute now more to open source, think about what that does for the quality of software around the world in everything that we do. So I think that is a wonderful note to end on. If you would join me in thanking these three people for doing this with us. Thank you. So come on. Well, Julian, thank you.
Thank you.
Latha, thank you. And Gautam, thank you very much.